Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the album from Dessa titled Parts of Speech. Now, exactly 100 video reviews ago, I talked about the debut album from Colette Carr titled Schizo, which, much to my surprise, actually turned out to be fairly decent. I mean, this was a white female rapper who pulled half her influences from Eminem and half her influences from the Spice Girls, so it would make some degree of sense to expect some questionable results from the combination. Now, fortunately for everyone who listened to that album, which wasn't enough people, Colette Carr proved to be actually a fairly solid performer, and Schizo was not a half-bad album. But if it did highlight anything, it only served to show how very few albums existed from female rappers in comparison with their male counterpart, let alone those that actually produced any viable hits. And the sad fact is that it actually seems to be getting worse as the years pass. At least in the late 90s and early 2000s, we had acts like Missy Elliott and Lil' Kim and Lauryn Hill who had mainstream success, or at least some elements of it, but who can you say fills that role now? I mean, the two that only really spring to mind for me is Nicki Minaj and MIA, maybe, with the former squandering all her talent, making increasingly bland and homogenous luxury rap, with the latter losing a lot of momentum in recent years. Now, fortunately, there are still plenty of female rappers who are out there making music, and great music at that. Unfortunately, they tend to be underground acts, and today we're going to be talking about one that really caught me by surprise. Dessa, a member of the Minneapolis hip-hop collective Doomtree. When she first released her album, Parts of Speech, back in September, I initially passed it over, but after hearing some rave reviews and recommendations from you guys, I figured I should get into her discography and get a feel for her music, really test out, see what she's made of. And man, I'm definitely glad I did that, because Dessa is awesome. With a measured yet forceful flow, Baroque pop-inspired production with a ton of flavor and texture, a superb singing voice, and strikingly intelligent lyrics, Dessa's first two records, A Badly Broken Code and Castor the Twin, were memorable and easily rose above the conventional topics in mainstream rap. And thus, you know what? I was really psyched to listen to her new album, Parts of Speech, after finishing off those two records. How did it turn out? Well, it's very good and definitely enjoyable, but as an album as a whole, Parts of Speech just isn't quite clicking for me in the same way that her previous records really did. And I think I finally have a handle on why. And yet, even with that comment, it still has a shot to make my list of one of the best albums of the year. Yes, that's how good Dessa is, and that's how much you guys should all check out this album. Even with my nitpicks, even saying it didn't quite work for me, it's still that great of an album. Now, what's important to stress is that the balance that Dessa has always maintained between hip-hop and R&B on her albums, this particular record definitely skews more towards the R&B end of the spectrum. And here's where we're gonna have to run into the first little nitpick that I personally have with this album. Now, don't get me wrong, she is a great R&B singer. Soulful, energetic, with a gift for smartly written lyrics and a theatrical style that lends a lot of dramatic flair to her presentation, and yet she's still able to convey that quiet elements of vulnerability when she absolutely has to. But one of Dessa's greatest strengths is that her flow as a rapper is unique, and one of the elements that makes her a distinctive presence, even before we actually get to the content in her verses. And as such, I can't help but feel that the shift towards R&B might not play to all of Dessa's strengths as a vocalist or a songwriter. And on top of that, I can't entirely say that I'm in favor of the shift in instrumental direction either, even though it's relatively minimal. Eschewing the classical or folk-inspired hip-hop beats in favor of something more modern, well, that's not a bad shift, and Dessa still brings enough of her own unique flavor. The piano, acoustic guitars, and string sections are thankfully going nowhere, and her brand of organic, rich production to make the tracks sound distinctive and immersive. She definitely brings all that to the table. But some of the melody lines have suffered in the transition towards more icy percussion and more tinny sounds and higher up in the mix. And considering that Dessa's hooks have never been consistently strong, a shift towards a less melody-driven direction might not have been the best musical direction, especially in a genre that's become oversaturated with icy, empty instrumentation. Now, granted, Dessa still does a phenomenal job selling those quieter, more melancholy emotions, but the more subdued instrumentation without the same bombast can make a few of the slower tempo tracks not stand out in the same way. But then again, the instrumentation has never been the star on Dessa's album, so Let's talk about songwriting and theme, shall we? Now, Dessa's always been a phenomenally smart songwriter with a gift for intricacy and variety in her metaphors and symbolism. But however, it does seem like the slide towards R&B has somewhat simplified the lyrics in favor of more personal songwriting, more impassioned delivery, which is the right direction to go if you're moving towards an R&B direction. Now, don't get me wrong, even in terms of that, even with her lyrics in that direction, she still leaps and bounds above most of her peers. But I have to say that there are notably less songs that have the same intricate stories that Dessa used to create. It used to be really compelling for me, and that's a little bit disappointing. There are also certain metaphors that Dessa is repeating from her previous albums, but to her credit, she does add enough additional flavor to justify that repetition. And even all that being said, the stories that she does tell, they're absolutely heartbreaking, and Dessa's powerful emotional range does a huge amount to actually sell them. The album's broad thematic arcs trigger and discusses lost connections, from those triggered by drugs and depression in The Man I Knew and Annabelle, failed relationships and friendships in Dear Marie, and the excellent Call Off Your Ghost, and even how Dessa's refusal to compromise and sell out might have actually hurt her career, and my personal favorite track on the album, Fighting Fish. Now, what's impressive about this album is Dessa's refusal not to tell the whole story. Songs like Dear Marie, The Lamb, and It's Only Me don't always paint her in the best light, but the emotional complexity that she lends to the writing really makes the song stand out and come across as memorable. What's interesting about Parts of Speech is that it doesn't really lend itself to a coherent through line. It's a series of vignettes and short stories, and while Dessa adds some personal touches to some stories, others she leaves rather ambiguous. Both Annabelle and I'm Going Down seem to imply that they're speaking from a different perspective through their uses of specific pronouns. But while it could hurt the personal connection that Dessa is trying to emphasize, her delivery salvages these tracks. Now, the short story element also manages to redeem the final track on the album, Sound the Bells, which draws an apocalyptic picture that might seem somewhat out of place with the rest of the album, but ultimately acts as the underlying message behind those lost connections. Whether or not you want to rebuild them or just leave them in the past, the time to do so, the time to actually make that decision is now. So, you know what? In the end, I really did like Parts of Speech from Dessa, even though I don't think it's her best. I've got to be honest, I prefer Dessa as a rapper with rich stories to tell rather than as an R&B act. But it's revealing of her talent that she can effectively pull off both on this album. And while I do wish the instrumentation had a little bit more flavor and bombast, I can't deny that Dessa's quieter expressions of vulnerability are delivered with a lot of emotional poignance and beauty. So with that, you know what? It's an 8 out of 10, and it's a solid recommendation from me. Check out Dessa's Parts of Speech, everybody, and let's hope for more female rappers getting success in 2014, because in this medium, we definitely need them. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Yes, it is a new set. I'm visiting my parents for the holidays, so I'm gonna be, the next couple, I'd say probably 3 or 4 or 5 videos will probably be shot from here. So with that in mind, if there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums you'd like me to take a look at coming up next year, make sure to mention them in the comments. Until then, see you next time.